Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, May 24th. This week, China launched major military exercises around Taiwan as what it called strong punishment for the newly inaugurated Taiwanese president Lai Chih-teng's speech emphasizing the sovereignty of the independent island. The exercises are a reminder that the Taiwan Straits remain one of the biggest geopolitical hotspots on Earth, despite big wars elsewhere. So, do the exercises suggest that war across the Strait is near? And what does the world want from Beijing and need to tell it? Then, a surprise election with likely a not very surprising outcome. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced the dissolution of Parliament and new elections set for July 4th, a date, of course, long celebrated in the United States to mark the colony's independence from the British Crown. The opposition Labour Party leads by 20 to 25 points in the latest poll, so why call an election that you're sure to lose? Then, finally, drama in the Middle East. The International Criminal Court asked for arrest warrants for Israel's and Hamas's top political and military leaders. The International Court of Justice just this morning demanded that Israel halt operations in Rafah, and Iran's president perished in stormy weather earlier this week. How will all this play out in what is still the world's most volatile region? Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Yasmeen Abutaleb, White House reporter for The Washington Post. Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs commentator for the Financial Times, and Carla Anne Robbins, Senior Fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Good morning, all. Good afternoon. Gideon, wonderful to have you here. Boy, what a week. We started talking earlier, we were just due to Middle East, and then bang, Rishi Sunak does the elections, and then the Chinese start military exercises. It was quite something to behold. But here, let's go and talk about it. Carla, let's start with you. In some ways, the least surprising, the fact that there were going to be these kinds of military exercises, because the inauguration of the new president was long planned, and the new president is not Beijing's favorite, as we also know. But still, pretty significant military activity in the Straits and indeed on the other side of the island, surrounding the entire island. What do we make from it? Why do you think this is happening, and how should we interpret it?
Well, they didn't like his predecessor, who was his boss, and they really don't like him. They don't like him. They go back 7 years to a comment that he made. He said he was a worker for independence. He said later, his supporters said he didn't really mean independence. He just meant autonomy, and they can't let it go. So as much as they didn't like his boss, his former president, they really don't like this guy. So it's not surprising that they're having these exercises. And there are two ways of looking at it. What they're doing is PLA has published these maps. They're surrounding the island. They've got 5 targeted areas. It's a way of looking at potentially a blockade, that's what they're drilling for. And it's a very clear, message here. They've been very clear rhetorically. They describe him as shameful. They say that this is a punishment, these exercises itself. So, they don't like him. They're saying some days we can come after you. On the other hand, by comparison with the exercises that they did when Nancy Pelosi went there, they're not as big. When Nancy Pelosi went there, they were shooting off missiles over Taiwan. So far, they haven't encroached over Taiwanese airspace, and they haven't gone into their waters. We're going to see a lot of these things. Much more. There's a whole debate here. How soon is it going to come? The U.S. military is planning for something that's going to happen the next few years, but there's a whole debate among analysts who say, don't hype out about this, that really it's going to be much more gray zone. They're going to be encroaching much more in their cyberspace and their economic space. Who knows what they're planning on doing? But what we do know more than anything else is they're not going to let up the pressure.
Gideon, you were just spent 3 months in Australia and Japan. There, the security elites must be looking at this as yet another step towards a much more volatile and uncertain region, and one that affects their security directly. What's the kind of conversations you had about Taiwan, and how worried do you think they are now, given the kind of exercises that are being played out, both with regard to an possibility of an invasion or, just as bad in some ways, the possibility of a blockade, or what the Chinese call a quarantine, because of course you can't blockade part of your own country.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that certainly if you think of the security elites in Canberra and Tokyo, they're very alarmed by all this. I wouldn't say that their analysis is that different from the analysis of Washington. In fact, in some ways, I thought I stayed in the most atypical Asian countries, because Japan and Australia, unlike, say, a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, have a very similar view of what China's up to the Americans, and they've adapted their foreign policies accordingly. The Australians made really kind of the biggest strategic move they've made for decades in the AUKUS pact, which will see them get nuclear-powered submarines from the US and the UK. And that's a bipartisan commitment driven essentially by fear of China. I mean, it's interesting that they won't quite say in public that those subs would be involved in a conflict over Taiwan. And when Kurt Campbell, the US Deputy Secretary of State, more or less said that in public, it caused a bit of a row in Australia. But essentially, talk to them behind the scenes. Of course, that's what it's about. And in Japan, similarly, although Shinzo Abe, the deceased former prime minister who was around for a long time, had a reputation as a nationalist and a hawk, his successor, Kishida, who's the current prime minister, who's regarded, his background is more moderate, has actually done a lot more than Abe was able to do in terms of increasing Japanese defense spending quite radically, revising the interpretation of the constitution to allow Japan to do a lot more in military terms. They're developing a fighter aircraft with the British and the Italians, which they've said they'll export, which is another Japanese taboo that's broken. And again, it's driven by fear of China. And interestingly, the Japanese see the threats from China and Russia as linked. They don't buy into this school you get in DC who say, well, forget about Russia, it's just China that matters. They've constantly made this link with Russia, and as they point out to you, Russia is also a neighbor of theirs. Vladivostok is closer to Japan than Beijing is. So they take the joint threats very seriously, and I think that they'll be keeping a very close eye on what's going on in Taiwan. But I think for the Japanese, actually getting involved in a war is still, a mental leap too far, at least for the general public. I don't know whether the security establishment have got there yet.
Yeah, although, these exercises are not only taking place very close to Taiwan, they're taking place very close to Japan, because the distance between Okinawa and on the one hand, and Japan on the in Okinawa and Japan on the one hand, and Taiwan on the other, is about 300 miles or so.
And they know that, obviously if there was a war, Okinawa would be a crucial base for the Americans, and therefore would be very vulnerable to being attacked by China, at which point Japan's in. So, yeah.
Yasmeen, when you walk the corridors of power and on your beat in the White House and in Washington, in some ways, not surprising that this has happened. Everybody knew something like this was going to come, but any reading different in terms of this is worrisome, or the other pieces? There's in Washington, the focus has been very much on an invasion. But this was a practice for a quarantine or a blockade, which is very much different and so much more difficult to deal with.
I think there is concern. I don't think there's a sense that an invasion that's been warned about in the next few years, like Carla said, is coming anytime soon. But I know from President Biden's perspective, he's always worried that a miscommunication or miscalculation is going to lead to escalation more than a very intentional provocation with China. And I think these types of exercises just significantly heighten the risk of something like that. I don't think it's unexpected to the White House, to Washington, that China would conduct these kind of drills after the new Taiwanese president was sworn in. But I think every time an incident like this happens, it raises the risk that there will be some kind of miscalculation, or the U.S. will misread something China did, or vice versa. And I think there's also quite a bit of fear. President Biden and Chinese President Xi just met in San Francisco back in November. I went for that summit. It was a very carefully choreographed summit. They had just restored military to military communications that had been down for 15 months after Nancy Pelosi's visit in August of 2022. So it took more than a year to restore that after China, of course, like Carla mentioned, those were more provocative drills because they were firing missiles over Taiwan. But still, there was no high level of military to military communication. And so I think, the fear is if China continues down this path or the U.S. responds in some way, I don't think there's any kind of U.S. response planned right now, that could lead to just undoing any progress that Biden and Xi made at that summit. That was a 3-hour meeting, extremely carefully choreographed, and not a whole lot came out of it other than returning things to the status quo before the Nancy Pelosi visit. So this is just a very delicate relationship. Both, I think Biden and Xi have shown they want to maintain some kind of high-level relationship, but it's worth remembering that there have been a couple of incidents in Biden's first term, including the spy balloon in February of 2023 that led to Secretary Blinken pulling down his trip to Beijing for several months. So I think those incidents are just worth remembering in terms of how fragile the U.S.-China relationship is.
No, I think that's very apt, and Carla, it's sort of, in your old beats, thinking about deterrence and how do you prevent wars from an accident. This is a pretty difficult set of situations. One, you have the miscommunication and escalation problem that Yasmeen talked about. The other is it's one thing to deter an outright invasion, which is not going to be easy under any circumstances. It's another to deter sort of a blockade, which the only way to really prevent it is to break it. So do you see Washington and the Washington military experts that you talk with really understanding the nature and the fragility of the relationship, and how do you think they're dealing with it?
I think, for the military, it's been much more focused on an invasion scenario. And whether that's been because it's been a justification to shift spending. You spend a lot more money if you're thinking about an invasion than if you are thinking about a blockade or a quarantine. And you had this whole sort of Pacific Command notion. It's 2027, we're going to be focused on this. And particularly after all of those decades of money being focused on the war against terrorism, this was, everybody was racing toward that, shiny object here of this invasion scenario. I think that the rational people are much more worried about what Yasmeen is talking about, a miscalculation, and particularly because as much as the Chinese may want to, for basic economic reasons, because they've been in economic trouble, they want to restore some sort of sane relationship with the United States, at least for right now. They're going around not just bullying the Taiwanese, they're bullying everybody. They're bullying particularly the Philippines, in with water cannons and everything else. So the potential for some sort of miscalculation there while the United States is steaming around saying we're going to keep these sea lanes open here. I think that's probably the most dangerous scenario right now, but that's not the sort of thing that the military gets a lot of money for. So you've got this disconnect of reality versus what planning is.
Yeah. Just a quick one, Eva. But I think that, although there is a difference between a blockade and a full-scale invasion, you may end up in the same place, because if you try and break a blockade, that could be a route to war. And similarly, I heard what Carla heard, in when I was talking to people in Tokyo, they were saying this was about a month ago, but in the immediate moment, that the Philippines stuff is actually more dangerous than Taiwan, that it's closer to sort of boiling over into a clash. And again, that could escalate quite easily. At the moment, it's relatively controlled. They're, after all, just spraying water at each other rather than shooting at each other. But, you could see how it got out of control.
Can I just make one other point about a blockade itself, which is Taiwan, has a pretty important strategic value in the global economy because of chips. And
we're not, for those British friends, we're not talking about French fries. We are talking about semiconductors.
Right.
We use them over here as well, Eva. I know we're backward, but
no, I know.
and not with bechamel sauce on. And the Chinese are caught between there's two responsibilities that they have here. They really want to take back Taiwan, versus this notion that they really are they may not be a responsible stakeholder, but they have they have an enormous stake in the global economy. And so, you start blockading Taiwan and you destroy the global economy for a long time before everyone starts getting their own autonomy on chips. So we can talk about the fear of this. I think squeezing Taiwan much more and making them feel vulnerable, whether it's in cyber or in economics, and not actually having a blockade, that's the biggest scenario. And that itself is very hard, because does it make the Taiwanese feel less confident, feel less that the United States can defend them? Because it's sort of hard to defend in a gray zone war, because it's not really a war.
Yeah, no, I think that's the key issue here. It's actually, when I was in Taiwan a year ago, what I heard is, in some ways, the United States is spending 90% of its time for a 10% likely scenario, which is an outright invasion, when in fact 90% of the chances are this salami tactics, bullying, and potential quarantine, and it's only spending 10% of its attention to that. That's true for the military. I don't think it's true for the civilian leadership, but it is a huge challenge when you think about it.
But it's true. But the civilian leadership, if Trump becomes president, I mean, that's the whole debate right now. I mean, if you saw Bridge Colby had that piece in the FT the other day, who's talked about for a key role in the Trump administration, saying it's not about Europe, it's about China, it's about Taiwan. And they were making the argument that we shouldn't have gotten involved in Ukraine because it was all about Taiwan. So you will see a shift among the civilians if Trump is reelected.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. But we're not going to talk about that election. Let's Gideon, let's shift to the one that's a little quicker. And you're in the FT newsroom, as we can see, and the people behind you are cracking down on what is unique. I think, or actually, we are the unique ones. We do elections for 4 years and then we do them again. You do them for 6 weeks. In the UK, and here's Rishi Sunak, sure to lose the election by any measure. Could be prime minister for another 6, 7, 8 months, and decides, I've had enough. Why did he decide to go to the polls at this time? First, and I guess second, what do you expect the campaign to be about?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. Why has he done it so early? Even members of his own party are pretty dismayed. I mean, for quite logistical reasons as well. A lot of candidates haven't been selected for a lot of seats, so that it's a local decision by the local Tory party, and wherever it is, Market, Raisin, or Newmarket, and they haven't got a candidate yet, and they've suddenly been told they've got 48 hours to find somebody. So it's pretty chaotic. I think the most probable explanations are that he's trying to take the Labour Party by surprise, that he has probably concluded that things ain't going to get any better, that he's not going to have room for tax cuts in September. They're making a great thing of the fact that inflation is finally turning down. They may hope that there's a sort of summer feel-good effect. People have even said, well, England, will be playing in the football around then, and we expect to win in the last 16. In fact, we're hoping to really thrash the Dutch, Evo, in that crucial game. And in fact, it's carefully timed. So we'll lose in the semi-finals to France, but the election's just before that. So we'll still be feeling good about the football. I don't know. It's pretty crazy stuff. I mean, but then there's other theories that actually it's more personal than that he's kind of fed up, that he can see the way it's going. So he thinks, well, I might as well get it over with. I mean, I doubt politicians think like that, but he doesn't. He's had a pretty disastrous start to the campaign. He did this sort of great speech outside Downing Street, and it was like torrential rain, and nobody had thought to give him an umbrella, so he's just standing there getting absolutely drenched. There's hecklers outside playing the Labour Party anthem, Things Can Only Get Better, so his words are completely drowned out. We don't have secret police here who could immediately arrest the protesters, so it went on and on and on. You couldn't hear what he was saying. All you could see was he was getting really, really wet. It was as campaign launches go, like a disaster. I think what they're going to try and do is run a sort of a bit of a you can't trust Labour campaign. You may not like us, but these guys are still socialists and they'll raise your taxes. They'll try that. They're also going to try and run a security campaign and say the world's a really dangerous place. Don't trust Labour. But the idea that this guy is somebody you're going to trust with your national security when he can't even get himself an umbrella, it makes you, it's not very convincing. So I think unless something extraordinary happens in the campaign, they're going to be absolutely smashed. And that's not a vote of confidence in Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, who's solid but very uncharismatic. He's no Tony Blair. They're not huge hopes invested in this guy. He's quite boring. But I think he's sort of reassuringly boring. He's hard to present as a crazy radical. So people are so tired of the Tories after Brexit, after Liz Truss, after 10 years of economic underperformance. It really is a sort of change election. And I think the only real question is the scale of their defeat. Will they have a kind of respectable defeat and still be left as a rump party with, which will select a new leader and just get on with opposition? Or will they kind of go down to a really historic defeat and, as some people suggest, get fewer than 100 seats in Parliament, in which case we're really in a new situation.
It's fascinating. I mean, those pictures of poor. I mean, you almost feel sorry for Rishi Sunak when.
I feel sorry for him that you can't even get his name right, which tells me how little impact is. Rishi Sunak.
Rishi Sunak. There you go.
But there you go. It tells you how little impact he's made on the world scene.
Prime Minister Sunak.
Yes.
How about that?
That's very good,
yeah, Rishi. That's correct. Well, thanks for correcting me, because I'll never do that again. Yasmeen, I think I have your name.
I blame
right.
him, Ivo, not you.
Yasmeen, clearly the White House was caught off guard. I mean, for them, the next time leaders descend on Washington is on the 9th of July, 5 days after this election, for the 75th anniversary summit of NATO. Any reaction from Washington? Of course, this is internal politics, so the Brits need to decide what the Brits need to decide. But what's the sense in the White House and elsewhere about what was surely a surprise for everybody?
I mean, it definitely took them by surprise, but I think the White House at this point has become quite adept at a sort of rotating cast of British leaders. So I don't think it'll fundamentally change much about the US-UK relationship. But like you said, it will be a sort of interesting twist to NATO in DC. Biden will probably meet for the first time with the new leader, which I think was similar to how he met Rishi Sunak. I can't remember the details, but I think they met for the first time at an international summit because he had just been elected after sort of a string of elections. I think by that point, Biden was on like his fourth British leader. So
I think it was a G20 or so. I think it was a G20 that it might have been, but it was an international meeting. Yeah.
Okay, right. that I think I was at the G20, so I think that might have been it, because we were sort of also struck by the side by side of Rishi Sunak and Joe Biden. Just a big age difference. But but I think, this is not totally new territory, and I don't know how much it would fundamentally shift Biden's relationship with whoever the new leader is.
And I think, actually it was interesting. I was just talking to some of the Labour people just before now, and they see that this is a big gift to them, because if they win, they start with a NATO summit within 4 or 5 days. They're already preparing for it. And I think in terms of US foreign policy, it's not really a problem. These are strong Atlanticists. If you read David Lammy, who's the shadow foreign secretary's big piece for foreign affairs, it starts with Ernest Bevin, who was the Labour foreign secretary, who helped to found NATO, which is a kind of signal of their kind of Atlanticism. But I think one interesting thing is that when Lammy was in Washington recently, he had a long stint with Jake Sullivan, but they also made the point to go and see J.D. Vance, to go and see Elbridge Colby. They're preparing for a possible Trump administration already.
Well, I mean, that's what good governance do. You prepare for whatever may happen. Carla, how do you the relationship, frankly, between the United States and Britain has not been great for a while, in part because of the Brexit issues. which of course Obama campaigned openly against. Trump had a strange relationship with Britain, certainly with Theresa May, somewhat less with Boris Johnson, and of course Joe Biden is first of all an Irish American, and never lets people forget it. How do you think a new Labour government will be positioned? How will Washington position with regard to a new Labour government, given what Gideon just said about the mainstream, but also perhaps a Labour government more interested in being more aligned with Europeans?
I think it's been all about Ukraine and NATO. I think that's what they think about at this point. And I think Sunak has been, great on that as far as, I think Yasmeen would know better on the daily basis, but that's the impression that I have been getting. I was fascinated by the Lamy visit itself, because he certainly was no Trump fan. I have this quote here from him. He once described Trump as a woman-hating, neo-Nazi sympathizing sociopath.
I thought those were all the Republican candidates in 2016 who called Trump that.
But they did what they did. He came then and he was praising Trump's defense record. And so they're coming through. I think it's been fascinating to see all of the the sort of axis of whatevers who've come through to Andrzej Duda and Viktor Orban and all the rightists who've come through to make nice in Mar-a-Lago and to kiss the ring. But then when you have someone like Lamy also coming through, I think they're making a calculation rather than the level of anxiety. But to go back to your question, Eva, the impression I'm getting is that they've found that the Brits have been quite dowdy supporters of the war in Ukraine, and that's been their major focus. And yes, he's an Irish American, but he's very much an Atlanticist, and the Brits have been great Atlanticists.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I do hear from some people that they hope that the new government be slightly less grandstanding, that is leading the pack when it comes to Ukraine, which frankly every British Prime Minister has done. And sort of put the U.S. in an awkward position, as David Cameron just did with regard to his speech in his visit to Kyiv, when he said, "Yeah, of course, we allow the Ukrainians to use our weapons against anybody at any time," and that puts pressure on Washington. They don't like that.
But they take it a lot more seriously than they do the French.
Well, that's true, but that's long been the case, at least since the Revolutionary Wars. Speaking of July 4th, as we would think about it, well, we won't go into the details of what psychological move led people to think that July 4th was a good time to have an election, but that's.
I have a theory about that, Ivo.
Yeah, okay.
Rishi Sunak used to have a green card. He had to give it up when he became Prime Minister. Right. And I wonder whether he's sending a signal that when he loses, he intends to return to the United States and take up a job in tech, which is that's what my interpretation of it.
Can I ask Gideon a really quick question?
Yeah.
Nigel Farage says he's going to come and campaign for Trump.
Yes, bizarre, isn't it? I mean, I wouldn't imagine that's going to swing many votes in Michigan, but but I think it tells you that his party, because of the nature of the British electoral system, first past the post, his party might get 15% of the vote and no seats. And he's run for Parliament 6 or 7 times and never got in. So why would he want to go through that humiliation again? And like a lot of people, he's beginning to, Britain's a relatively small pool. So for him, being a buddy of Trump and being on the campaign trail with Trump, there may be more percentage in that than, running a losing election campaign in a sort of obscure bit of Britain.
He probably realizes that if Trump wins, he's not going to be Britain's ambassador to Washington. So might as well just maybe he'll become the the U.S. ambassador to UK. Who knows? Anything can happen. Yeah. Yasmeen, more serious. Anyway, we will come back to the election because it's going to be important as it takes place over the next few weeks. But Yasmeen, I think so, Eva. Well, all elections matter. All elections matter. Because after all, they are about elections. They're about the people choosing their governments, which is one of the things that is supposedly distinguishes us from so many other countries. Us collectively here on the screen. Yasmeen, more seriously, or not that elections are not serious; they're very serious, deadly serious. The Middle East, lots of things happening. I mentioned a few in the intro: the ICC arrest warrants, the IJC decision on Rafah, which of course is unenforceable, the Iranian president helicopter accident, which clearly looks like an accident, and continuing differences between the United States and Israel on the issue of Rafah, and within Israel, continuing differences over post-war Gaza. Lots of things to talk about. You follow this as close as anyone. What do you take from the week? How do we look at the next week on all of these issues?
It was a pretty extraordinary week in terms of developments. I'll start with the death of the Iranian president, just because I think that does not fundamentally shift the landscape. It was obviously a shock. There was reporting that Iran actually reached out to the U.S. for help in locating the helicopter once it went down, which I think is important, just that it signals the U.S. and Iran do seem to have some kind of back channel communication through all this. And obviously one of the things the U.S. has been able to do in this just horrific war is contain it mostly to Gaza. There's obviously been involvement by Iranian proxies and the risk of escalation, but not that full-scale regional war that everyone feared in the first few weeks. So I think the death of Ibrahim Raisi is a shock, but I don't think there's any sense that it's going to fundamentally shift the U.S. relationship with Iran, what Iran is doing with Israel, or the relationship in the Middle East. So, I'll just address that first, because I think it's sort of doesn't change much. I think the bigger issue here, the ICC arrest warrants were very important in that it obviously further isolated Israel, these arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. And they focused on Israel using starvation as a weapon of war rather than focusing on civilian death tolls or, what they might characterize as disproportionate attacks. And I think that's because they felt that the using starvation as a weapon of war was the strongest legal argument that they had. And I think the reason Gallant was grouped into this is in the beginning of the war on October 9th or 10th, he made a comment where he said the Palestinians were human animals and that they were going to treat them as such. And so that statement has been used in the ICJ case that South Africa brought against Israel. And then, of course, came up in the ICC arrest warrants. And their argument is that this is very clear evidence that this is what Israel tried to do, because he made that comment when he was announcing that Israel was embarking on this full siege of Gaza, not allowing any aid in. And then, of course, there's, northern Gaza, more than 1 million people are in the throes of famine right now. Aid has not really gotten into Gaza for about 2 weeks now because Israel seized the Rafah border crossing. Egypt is not allowing aid to go through Rafah. The Kerem Shalom crossing is open, but there are reports that it's as few as 5 or 8 trucks per day getting in there, sometimes none. So, it's just a really, really horrific situation on the ground. Everyone in Gaza is facing severe hunger, with more than half of the population in famine conditions. And so, this further isolates Israel. And the other thing is it puts the U.S. in a difficult position because President Biden and most members of Congress came out and immediately rebuked the ICC arrest warrant, saying that the Israeli government and Hamas should not be put on the same plane, that this was not equal because there were arrest warrants issued for 3 Hamas leaders as well, including Yahya Sinwar. But I think that there is the risk that this further isolates the U.S. because France and a number of European countries have supported the arrest warrants. Ireland, Norway, and what was the third country? Spain, thank you, recognized the Palestinian state this week. So this is just also further isolating the U.S. in terms of its support for Israel. And then I think the important dynamic within Israel is there was really a backlash taking place against Benjamin Netanyahu. Benny Gantz had made a pretty striking speech saying that he needed to come up with a plan for the day after Gaza. There was a fear that he was moving towards an indefinite occupation of Gaza, which Netanyahu's far-right cabinet ministers favor. And then the ICC arrest warrants had the effect of sort of rallying support back around Netanyahu. And so I think that could be a source of frustration for people who are looking for new Israeli leadership in the thought that you could actually start to work towards a day after and a peace process more effectively with a new government.
A lot of news there. Great summary, Yasmeen, of all the sort of the big issues and lots of questions, I guess. I mean, Gideon, you wrote about the ICC warrant and its implication in Israel and internationally. I do wonder sort of how you look at the international implication of this. I mean, Yasmeen rightly, I think, says it's further isolating Israel and really I assume the IJC ruling, which will be ignored today, will do the same. How sustainable is it to continue to be supporting Israel, and given the international isolationism that Israel now suffers?
Well, I mean, I think that, one thing that we're going to see emerging is a split between the US and Europe on this. Just as Ukraine united the Atlantic Alliance, I think Israel's going to split it, specifically over this issue of the ICC, because the whole idea of the European Union is based around international law, and they take this stuff much more seriously than people do in Washington. So I think that, although some European governments, Britain, have sort of brushed aside the ICC thing, actually the French and significantly the Germans, who've been really the most pro-Israel government in the EU, have backed the ICC, or at least said you can't just ignore this. And I think that the Israelis may take slightly false comfort from the very strong support they've got from the US. They, believe that as long as they have American support, they'll be okay. And that's true to some extent, but I don't think it will mean, unless you get a total collapse of the ICC, which I don't think will happen in the short term, that this warrant will somehow be expunged if the judges agree to it. And if it's issued, it's non-revocable. So at that point, Netanyahu effectively can't travel in Europe, and neither can Gallant. And that's a problem not just for them, it's a problem for the entire Israeli state. Yeah, I think it's much more of a problem for the Israelis than their initial sort of united outrage would suggest, or the bravado of a Netanyahu would suggest. And I hope that over time, I mean, I can understand the Israeli kind of rallying around together against what they regard as a kind of outrageous slur on their nation. But maybe there might be a sort of second or third thoughts where they think, actually, we've really got to take this quite seriously because we are becoming a pariah state, and adjust their behavior accordingly.
Carla, you think they're going to adjust their behavior accordingly? And importantly, do you think the United States' initial reaction is going to hold?
Two questions. And a third point. One, I asked the question of David Sheffer, the negotiated the creation of the ICC, and was a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And I said to him, I understand that the court does these things for deterrent reasons, but you back people into a corner once, and it seems like you can't lift this. Netanyahu's basically has nothing to lose at this point because he's never going to get out of the box. And what Sheffer said, which I hadn't realized, he said, actually, as part of a peace negotiation, the Security Council could lift year by year the warrant. And I didn't realize that. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on the ICC. Now, it's only would be a 1-year reprieve, but it could be part of a peace settlement for both sides, as an incentive for negotiations, which I thought was quite interesting. So I will do this now. Are these? I agree with Gideon. I think that what Bibi's doing, he went on, he did this video statement and he said, it's not just me, it's the Israeli people and it's Israeli soldiers. And I think that certainly in the near term is quite, compelling for people. I think people are still reeling from the shock of October 7th. And I think this notion of the world is out to get us goes back years and years and years. Zionism is racism at the UN. I think that's the sort of the basic reaction in Israel. But as Yasmeen said, before the ICC indictment, you were seeing really profound cracks in his war cabinet, not over the isolation, not over things like the ICC, which they knew were coming. I mean, this was leaked. We knew this was coming. This wasn't a big shock. It's really over what's going to happen to Gaza. most people don't want to occupy Gaza afterwards. The Israeli military doesn't want to occupy. Gallant doesn't want to occupy Gaza. Benny Gantz doesn't want to occupy. And so people want to plan for afterwards. And so I think that Bibi doesn't have a future. I think that his ultra extreme notion of what comes afterwards is what's going to break the system. And so that is another isolating factor itself. So I think all of these things come together and they can't persist in this.
And I guess, Yasmeen, you talk to the White House every day about these issues. They know that's the reality, and yet they're unable to move. And in some ways, the ICC reaction and the strong reaction on Capitol Hill as well among Republicans and of the administration sort of makes it even less likely that they're going to move in a way that alters and changes the attention in Israel, and we're just going to be stuck in the same way we've been stuck for months.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to note that Biden's relationship with Netanyahu had all but sort of broken down before the ICC arrest warrants. Biden had issued this threat a little over a month ago that he would reassess the entire U.S. policy toward Gaza. He, of course, this month said he would withhold offensive weapons if they move forward with an invasion of Rafah. And that's another point of tension. Israel is conducting pretty extensive operations in Rafah. More than 800,000 Palestinians have evacuated. One thing that I think is important to note is I had done this story about 2 weeks ago, looking at the U.S. conversations with Israel on a Rafah operation. And, Biden has said bombing population centers is his red line. But the thing is, part of the U.S. Negotiations on a Rafah operation was that they couldn't simply evacuate Palestinians because most of Gaza is just reduced to rubble at this point. They had to set up tent cities. They had to make sure there was food and repaired water pipes and, some sort of basic shelter and necessities like that. This was somewhat habitable for people to go to. 800,000 people have fled without any of those arrangements being made. And in fact, even less aid going in than there's been through most of the war, which has already been a pretty paltry amount. So a lot of people are just going back to the rubble of Khan Yunis and looting the few aid trucks that do come in. So Israel has violated many of the parameters the U.S. put in place for a Rafah operation, but I think it's been clear the president has been highly, highly reluctant to follow through on that threat. And it seems the thing that they are most adamant about avoiding is these images we've seen for most of the war of just mass death and destruction. And short of that, they're probably pretty unlikely to enforce any sort of red line. And then, of course, with the ICC arrest warrants, they're back in a defensive posture of Israel. So you haven't actually heard them talk about the aid situation or what's going on in Rafah or what might prompt them to reassess the U.S. policy.
Mike Johnson said last night that, that the Congress is inviting Bibi to come to a joint session soon, which is really, an act of solidarity with Israel and a really incredible way to jam the Democrats and to jam Biden itself. What are they saying in the White House about that? They must be tearing their hair out. It's like Bibi coming when John Boehner invited him as a way to really jam Obama. Already you can see all these Democrats hand-wringing about whether they should go to the speech, whether they should boycott the speech. And Mike Johnson, also Elise Stefanik just went to Israel and delivered a speech at the Knesset where she praised Trump. She effectively campaigned for Trump, blasted Biden, said the U.S. under no circumstances should ever be withholding aid to Israel or cutting off aid to Israel. So Republicans are really undercutting Biden and any sort of warning they're trying to issue Israel, and really making a political statement by trying to position themselves as the party who's loyal to Netanyahu, who's loyal to Israel, and Democrats as the one who are caving to the left. The whole thing has really devolved into sort of a political sideshow.
Gideon, last point to you, because I think the U.S. is the critical element, but just to push you on and combine with the earlier discussion on where do you think a labor government is going to be with regard to the Middle East, if in fact Europe is now moving, including the Germans, as you rightly said, most pro-Israeli country in Europe, to distance itself not just from Israel, but by doing so also from the United States. Do you think a new labor government will be more sympathetic to the European line or to the U.S. line?
I think they'll be closer to the European line. And you've seen that already, that actually, although Sunak's government took the US line on the ICC, Starmer took the German line on the ICC, which is we should follow it. But it's a huge issue domestically for Labour as well, because the Muslim vote is very important to Labour. People are outraged and they're going to lose a lot of votes over this. They lost a by-election just recently because they lost Muslim votes on this.
They being the
Labour Party. The Labour Party. Basically, it's 5% of the population, but in certain northern seats, it's 30-40% of the electorate. And there will be protest candidates running against Labour candidates precisely because Starmer has actually been, by Labour standards, pretty pro-Israel. And indeed, going back in Labour history, his fight with Jeremy Corbyn was about the Middle East, essentially, and accusations that Corbyn was anti-Semitic and so on. So in that sense, Starmer's been pretty pro-Israel, but he has to be mindful of his electorate. It would be much more of a problem for him were this not such a blowout election. If it was a close election, it would be a real issue for Labour. But because the Tories are in such disarray, they can probably afford to take a hit in Gaza. But individual Labour MPs, some of them quite high profile, may actually lose their seats over this. So it's a tough issue for him. And I think that they will maintain a line that Israel has a right to self-defense, but they will not go up against the ICC.
Well, we'll have to wait and see how it goes. But clearly, these issues are not going away. Whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in East Asia, whether it's elections and their implications in Europe, and nor will World Review. But we've highlighted all of this with three people who are terrific. As always, Carla Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations, Gideon Rachman of the Financial Times, Yasmeen Abutaleb of the Washington Post. Thank you all three for making us a little wiser on a Friday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are tuning in. And all of you, thanks for watching and thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.